Today, we delve deeper into the early days of the American Republic during the era of the American Revolution. This episode builds upon our recent explorations of Middle Tennessee's early history. Previously, we briefly discussed the capture of Mary Neely in 1780, following the tragic loss of her father, who was killed while gathering salt. The source material we used didn't elaborate much on Mary's time in captivity, so today's episode will share a full account of her experiences, including her life after escape. We'll be reading from the March 1853 issue of Putnam's magazine, where her story was recounted under the title Mary Spears, penned by James B. Beekman. This article, based on Mary's and her family's first-hand accounts, was published just a year after her passing, offering an authentic portrayal of the hardships she endured and her encounters on the frontier after her eventual escape. Now here is the story of Mary Neely Spears, who was captured in Tennessee in 1780. The following episodes of her life on the frontier were recorded from details shared by an accomplished woman residing at Paddock's Grove in Illinois. These recollections, told by Mary herself, her children, and her close friends, are presented as originally narrated without embellishment. Mary Neely was born on August 20th, 1761, near Charleston, South Carolina. In her youth, her father moved the family to Tennessee, leading them through Georgia and eventually arriving near present-day Chattanooga. The family journeyed along the Tennessee River in canoes, carrying household items, clothing, and provisions, while her father guided their horses and cattle along the riverbank. They reunited at Muscle Shoals and continued overland to what later became known as Neely's Bend on the Cumberland River near Nashville. This journey likely coincided with the first known discovery of French Lick, recorded by Haywood, which was made by a group of adventurers descending the Cumberland toward Natchez. Mary's family lived here for years among buffalo, elk, and wolves, which roamed the surrounding hills and forests. They encountered few other settlers, with only the occasional French hunter or trapper venturing from the north into these remote wildernesses. Neely took it upon herself to educate her daughters, guiding them through their spelling and reading lessons while she spun thread on her little wheel for their clothing. This modest instruction was all the education the girls received. As more settlers arrived and a rudimentary school opened nearby, the sons walked the 3-mile journey through wolf-infested woods to attend, often riding horseback for safety. With the onset of the Revolutionary War and growing hostilities threatening these isolated settlements, the family and neighboring settlers sought shelter within a fort. The men ventured out when possible to tend cattle and work the fields, while Neely continued his salt-making, sometimes with the help of his daughter, known as Mary or Polly. On a quiet Sunday morning in the autumn of 1780, Mary donned her Sunday best and joined her father along the riverbank, where he had been making salt for the past week. Standing a short distance from him, she suddenly heard the crack of a gun and saw him collapse. She briefly glimpsed an Indian emerging from cover before fainting in shock. Upon regaining consciousness, she found herself seized by 2 Indians, who hurriedly dragged her away, fearful of a rescue attempt from the nearby station. Yet, no help came, and Mary was forced to accompany her captors. For 3 days, they traveled without food until a bear was finally hunted down. A small piece of raw meat was given to the starving captive, which, in her desperation, she ate uncooked. This caused a severe illness, which was eventually eased with bear oil, a remedy prescribed by the tribe. Mary was then given a choice: to become the wife of the chief's son or serve as a slave to the chief's eldest wife. Opting for the latter, she soon became so valuable that her captors chose to spare her life. The group roamed Tennessee and Kentucky, often setting up camp in dense cane thickets. Desperately clinging to the hope of returning home, Mary once attempted an escape, but her foot was impaled by a sharp piece of cane, piercing it completely. She was quickly recaptured and endured excruciating pain from the wound, which would take months to heal fully. During her captivity, Mary had managed to learn some of the Indian language and often overheard conversations suggesting she should be killed and scalped, as she was seen as a burden due to her injured foot. Likely, her life was spared only because of her skill in sewing and other useful tasks. which made her a valuable servant to her captors. Despite the failure of her earlier escape attempt, she held fast to the hope that a chance to flee might one day present itself. One evening, while the group camped by a small stream, a fierce storm arose. To shield herself from the weather, Mary climbed into a tree draped with thick grapevines, which provided natural shelter. Not long after, a powerful gust uprooted a large tree nearby, which crashed directly onto the spot she had just vacated. Amidst the darkness and driving rain, she could hear the Indians calling her name, trying to locate her. When no response came, they assumed she had been killed by the fallen tree. A surge of hope filled her heart. This might be her chance to escape. Mary remained hidden as the Indians called out repeatedly. But as their voices faded, fear began to dampen her newfound hope. She remembered the severe punishment she had endured for her previous escape attempt and the threat of the tomahawk if she tried again. She knew that if she left the tree, the dogs would likely sniff her out and alert the others. On the other hand, could she not view her choice to seek shelter and the miraculous fall of the tree as a sign of providential intervention? Perhaps this protection was something she could rely upon. Torn between these thoughts, she remained hidden in the tree throughout the night, ignoring the intermittent calls of her captors in hopes that they might abandon their search and move on by dawn, as they often did when fearing pursuit. However, by morning, she was discovered and forced to continue with them on their northward journey. Crossing the Ohio River extinguished the faint hope she had clung to of reuniting with her family. With the loss of that hope, even her faith in the merciful Father who had safeguarded her through countless dangers began to falter. The unrelenting hardships of hunger, cold, and exhaustion were more than her strength could bear. It seemed as though fate took pleasure in mocking her with fleeting chances of escape, always just beyond reach. One night, as they camped, a snowstorm swept over them, blanketing her entirely under a drift. By morning, when the Indians prepared to leave, they couldn't find her and assumed she had fled in the night. Their rage was palpable, with furious threats of brutal punishment should they recapture her. Only partially hearing their shouts and understanding that she was being sought, Mary emerged from beneath her snow cover, directly among her astonished captors. Their startled reactions turned into deafening laughter and shouts of amazement when they realized the truth. The bitter thought struck her that had she known she was so thoroughly concealed, she might have remained safely hidden. The Indians' morning meal was a large black snake, roasted and shared among them, a grim reminder of the harsh and unyielding life she was forced to endure. Only a few inches of the meal were given to the poor girl, but her intense hunger transformed it into a satisfying feast. Mary was always permitted to share in whatever provisions her captors had. On one occasion, when the men were away from camp, a large deer suddenly appeared, heading directly toward them. The old chief's wife urged Mary to take up a gun and shoot the animal, as she was reputedly the best shot among the women. However, the chief had strictly forbidden anyone from firing in the men's absence, as a gunshot served as the signal of an enemy's approach. Mary hesitated, fearing the consequences, but at the woman's insistence, she fired and successfully brought down the deer. Moments later, the Indians rushed back to camp, expecting an attack. When they realized it was a false alarm, the chief raised his tomahawk in fury, ready to punish the girl who had dared to disobey him. His wife quickly intervened, placing herself between him and Mary and taking the blame upon herself. But as the chief swung his tomahawk menacingly around his head, Mary braced herself, fearing he would strike. Perhaps the promise of fresh venison for supper tempered his anger, and he eventually relented. On another occasion, the smallpox broke out among the group, and the chief himself fell gravely ill with the deadly disease. For 10 days, Mary was entirely blind, isolated in a small lodge near a spring, built at a distance from the main camp. Each day, her food was left by the spring, and she would feel her way there once every 24 hours. Her sufferings were somewhat relieved by an ointment prepared by a sympathetic woman from the tribe, who simmered prickly pear in bear's grease. In this painful solitude, Mary's despair grew, and there were moments when she longed for death or felt tempted to tear open the ulcers covering her face. Yet thoughts of home and the faint hope of one day escaping her captivity gave her the strength to endure these prolonged hardships. Some of her possessions had been taken, but she still managed to keep a knife, which she guarded carefully. Whenever unobserved, she would carve her name into the bark of trees, hoping these marks might someday lead rescuers to her. She also retained a pair of silver shoe buckles, items the captors had not taken from her. The group seemed to remain for about a year in the northwestern region of Tennessee, near the forks of the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers and close to where the Ohio meets the Mississippi. They later moved into what is now Indiana, stopping briefly at a location known as French Lick. During this time, other captives from Tennessee and Kentucky joined the camp, including a man named Riddle and his two daughters, with whom Mary occasionally spent time. Whenever her health allowed, Mary engaged in various tasks, finding solace in hard work despite its difficulty. The only task she disliked was molding bullets, a job she was often forced to perform. As the journey continued, she met a French fur trader, to whom she pleaded for help in escaping. He ignored her pleas, and she left feeling indignation at his lack of compassion. Perhaps feeling remorse, he returned the next day with a blanket as a peace offering. But she refused it, scornfully rejecting aid from someone she saw as too cowardly to assist her when she needed it most. After crossing into Michigan, their numbers grew with the arrival of more captives. One woman, weakened from the journey and carrying an infant just a few months old, struggled to keep pace, despite occasional help from kind-hearted members of the tribe. That evening, as they settled around a campfire, the men held a grim council. Deciding the child was too great a burden, they stoked the fire until only a bed of glowing embers remained. In a heart-wrenching act, one of the warriors seized the infant from its mother's arms and cast it into the fire. The infant was cruelly drawn from the flames, only to be thrust back into its mother's arms, then seized once more and thrown into the fire. This horrific act repeated amidst the anguished screams of the parents and the blood-chilling yells of the captors, who leapt and danced around the scene with frenzied gestures, until the child's life was extinguished. When at last the little one was lifeless, the captors tore the remains apart in a display of merciless brutality. Such sights, not uncommon in her captivity, instilled in Mary Neely an enduring loathing toward those responsible for such acts. This feeling grew into a deep-seated hatred she could never fully relinquish. She avoided speaking their language whenever possible, and often said that the only favor she ever asked of them was for a merciful death. Later in life, when a beloved granddaughter, a child Mary had raised herself, expressed a wish to wear earrings and was about to buy a pair, Mary persuaded her against it with solemnity, saying she would feel heartache each time she saw her adorned with ornaments that reminded her so vividly of her former captors. Mary's experiences included witnessing punishments within the tribe, such as that of a young man and his lover who, bound to separate trees, were stoned to death, a rare punishment, even among these tribes. The white prisoners were forced to watch, adding to their mental torment. Many more tales of Mary's ordeals, adventures, and courage in the wilderness have been passed down through her family, preserving her story of endurance amid her time with her fierce captors. The constraints of a brief account allow us to focus only on key events that capture the experiences shared by many during those perilous early days of the Republic. After 2 long years in captivity, Mary and other prisoners were taken to Detroit, where the Indians anticipated receiving compensation from the British for the scalps they had brought as trophies. The British regarded their alliance with the Indians as valuable and thus treated them with considerable respect. While camped near the city, Mary was assigned a daily task of visiting a French household to collect milk for the chief's sick child. The lady of the house became curious about Mary and, upon learning her story, grew sympathetic. One day, the lady instructed Mary to come back the next morning, leave her milk outside the gate, enter the house quietly, and go directly to a specified room. For weeks, Mary had been suffering from bouts of chills and fever, which clouded her thinking. On the following morning, when the fever was at its peak, she found herself desperately searching for her only remaining possession of value, a single silver shoe. Buckle. Her master, impatient with her delay, struck her and threatened to kill her if she hesitated any longer. Momentarily forgetting the hope of escape due to the pain and confusion from the fever, she pleaded with him to end her suffering. Yet, regaining her resolve, she set out for the milk. By the time she reached the French gate, Mary's mind had cleared enough to remember the lady's instructions from the previous day. When the Indians later came to search for her, they were told that she had angrily thrown down the milk can and stormed off down the street. Unsure of where she had gone, they left. The next day, city officials, alerted by the Indians, searched the house but found no sign of Mary, as she lay hidden in a small, dark closet concealed within a larger room, built to secure valuables during potential raids. For a month, Mary remained safely concealed there, nurtured by her compassionate benefactress. One incident nearly betrayed her. Looking out of the window one day, she was startled to lock eyes with an Indian she recognized, and by his expression, she realized he had recognized her too. Alarmed, Mary quickly told her protector, imploring for immediate assistance, as she knew her captors would waste no time reclaiming her. Mary was immediately provided with boys' clothing, which she quickly donned. Her hair was cut short to complete her disguise, and she was escorted by her hostess's son half a mile into the city to the home of another compassionate Frenchwoman, who sheltered her for several weeks. During this time, she worked as a seamstress for a tailor, allowing her to earn enough to dress herself comfortably. Once the threat of pursuit subsided, Mary was moved under the cover of night to an island in the river, where she reunited with 17 other captives she had encountered in her travels through Indiana, Ohio, or Michigan. Some had been bought from the Indians by the British authorities, while others had escaped with the help of sympathetic French residents in the city. Mary remained on the island for just 3 weeks. The captives were then transported by boat down the lakes, stopping briefly at Niagara and along the St. Lawrence River until they reached the shore of Lake Champlain, where they were exchanged as prisoners of war. Before disembarking, a British officer attempted to secure a promise from the group, which included women, elderly men, and boys, that they would not support or assist the Continentals in the ongoing war. Mary proudly recounted how she flatly refused, challenging the officer to step ashore with her into a thicket, where she vowed to cut a switch and give him a sound thrashing until he, instead, would promise never to set foot on American soil again. Even in her 90s, Mary would recall this story with the same pride and vigor as she had felt decades before. Inspired by her defiance, the others followed suit, cutting switches as soon as they were ashore, taunting the officer to face them, and ending with 3 cheers for their brave young leader. Mary's companions informed her that they expected one of the American generals to arrive within a few days, and that he would provide her with a horse and saddle. She traveled with them for several days, and when some faltered from exhaustion, unable to continue, she pressed on in hopes of finding work among the Dutch settlers. Her only companions were now an old man and 2 boys. After a couple of grueling days trekking through snow, they too gave up, leaving Mary to face the journey alone. It was a somber day for her, as she trudged through snow and icy water, her feet sinking with every step. Toward evening, a heavy rain further drenched her already weary body, yet her courage remained steady. The thought of finally reaching her beloved home filled her with the resolve to keep going, knowing her success now depended solely on her own endurance. She continued walking until after dark, when she reached the door of a small cabin illuminated by a warm, inviting glow from within. The sight of large logs blazing in the hearth was heartening, though the cabin held few other comforts, barely a scrap of bread and not a single bed to ease her tired limbs. Still accustomed to hardship, Mary lay down on the floor near the fire, her feet toward the warmth, and without bothering to dry her clothes, quickly fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, she awoke in severe discomfort, her lungs feeling oppressed, and her voice reduced to a whisper. The woman in the cabin, though incredibly poor, showed Mary great kindness and did what she could to comfort her suffering guest. Having learned about ailments and basic remedies from her time among the Indians, Mary put this knowledge to use, treating herself as best she could with the few resources available. Mary happened to have a few medicines with her, which she instructed the kind woman to prepare and administer. Despite a severe bout of illness, her youthful resilience, fortified by a life of enduring hardships, eventually prevailed. Yet, it took several weeks for her to regain the strength needed to travel. Mindful of the risk of scurvy, from which she had previously suffered, Mary obtained a small amount of snuff and other simple remedies from a nearby settlement a few days' journey away, spending nearly her last penny on these items and on a small Japanese snuff box. She later gifted this box to the narrator of her story as a memento of her remarkable journey. While in the settlement, Mary heard of a local farmer planning to move his family to southwestern Virginia in the spring. His wife was in need of someone to help with spinning, weaving, and sewing clothing for the men and boys, a welcome opportunity for Mary. Without delay, she offered her services and was accepted. Throughout the winter she worked tirelessly, taking on additional tasks like washing the family's laundry and milking the cows. With only 50 cents a week as payment, along with a portion of her wages held back, she labored from dawn until late at night with scarcely a moment's rest. When spring arrived and the family set out for their southward journey, Mary assisted with every aspect of the trip, from cooking to herding the livestock. She walked nearly the entire distance, compensated solely with food, lodging, and the protection afforded by traveling with a group. Despite the modest return for her labor, Mary remembered this family with deep gratitude and warmth, often speaking of them with heartfelt affection throughout her life. For Mary, this family's warmth and kindness marked the first real experience of human sympathy and the comfort of home since her sorrowful captivity. Her generous heart overflowed with gratitude, and the hard work she provided seemed insignificant in comparison to the kindness she received. When they reached the Susquehanna River, Mary was required to pay her own ferry fare as agreed. Resourceful as ever, she asked the ferryman if she might paddle herself across in a small, leaky canoe lying nearby. Though he cautioned her about the risk, she was an excellent swimmer and determined to save her money. She safely navigated the river in the canoe, while those on the ferry were not as fortunate. Midway across, a frightened cow leapt overboard and swam back to shore. The Dutch farmer asked Mary to help retrieve the animal. Without hesitation, she returned, secured the cow on board, and holding it by the horn with her left hand while keeping her right fingers in its nostrils, calmed the animal for nearly a mile. Such practicality and skill might seem unusual today, yet it was typical of that era's women, who took pride